You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision making. Welcome to the Decisive Podcast, brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're discussing Canada's economy with Economics Director Arlene Kish, who is speaking with us from Toronto. Arlene, welcome back to the podcast. It is great to have you on the Decisive.
To be back, Kristen. It's a very interesting times and it's filled with a lot of uncertainty, causing businesses to rethink strategies and supply chains, and for consumers to think twice about where and how their disposable income to be spent. And so overall, there's a lot to consider right now.
Interesting times indeed. So, Arlene, let's tackle tariffs first, since that is the hot topic. And let's start with a little history lesson. What happened in the first Trump administration with tariffs on Canadian goods?
Well, at the time, we have to remember that the NAFTA agreement was up for renewal, and President Trump obviously didn't like the terms of the deal. So initially, Trump imposed a 20% tariff on softwood lumber, which has been a highly disputed commodity for a while between our two countries. And then a year later, in about May of 2018, a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum was announced. Now, altogether, after NAFTA became the new negotiated USMCA, as they like to refer to it in the US, in October of 2018, tariffs weren't removed until the trade agreement became official in July of 2020. And right after that, overall trade of steel and aluminum, it declined sharply once the tariffs were imposed. There was a hit to trade, but not a large degree given the share of those traded goods with the US and Canada.
And how did Canada respond at that time, Arlene?
Well, we responded with counter tariffs on steel and aluminum, but we also imposed tariffs on a long list of strategic and targeted items that were directed towards Republican and border states. In all, they totaled about $16.6 billion. And these included items like Harley Davidson motorcycles, Florida orange juice, bourbon, maple syrup, shaving products, and even ketchup.
Ketchup. I didn't have that on my bingo card. So, Arlene, what are you assuming about US tariffs on Canadian goods in Trump's second term? What's in your model right now?
Well, obviously, we were having big discussions with all of my colleagues. Specifically, in talking with our US colleagues, we're assuming a 10% US tariff on Canadian export goods, which is unchanged from our initial call back in December after President Trump made the initial announcement. The 25% US tariff on steel and aluminum was also imposed in the assumption for our latest forecast. And in response, we are assuming that Canada's counter tariffs would be of the same magnitude at 10%, but we are not including a tariff on energy, as government officials want to limit the downturn on the economy, given that energy is our biggest export. Plus, it would limit the upward inflationary pressure on Canadians.
And what would the impact be on the Canadian economy if these 25% tariffs go forward? Under what circumstances could tariffs cause a recession?
Now, what we have in, like I said, built into our forecast, we already noticed that the Canadian economy would be hit hard. The assumptions that we made with the 10% tariff and the counter tariff, that impact would lower real GDP growth by about half a percentage point this year and next. Before the tariff announcement, we were expecting real GDP growth to be about 2%. Now it's knocked down to 1.5% for this year. And next year, it was pegged at 2.3%, and that's been lowered down to 1.7%. And the main drivers of near term growth were household and government consumption. Investment spending was expected to rebound this year, but that was attributed mostly to gains in residential investment amid low borrowing costs and earlier pent up demand for housing, given that we've had a surge in population growth over the past several years. Now, net trade was going to be adding to growth, but the industrial production outlook somewhat bleak because we're seeing that there's going to be a greater downside pressure coming from the manufacturing industry, given the uncertainty regarding trade. Now, our modeling team has done some scenario outcomes if 25% tariffs were imposed on Canada. It also includes tariffs at different rates on different countries and regions for the rest of the world. As such, the impacts results in reduced global demand. Now, that's not to say that this is our forecast right now, but it's a valuable exercise to look at what a 25% permanent tariff would mean for Canada's economy over the longer term. Overall, the biggest hit to annual real GDP growth comes in 2026 and 27 across all sectors. It is important to know that real GDP levels do not get back to our November baseline forecast, as real GDP is about 2.9% below our baseline forecast 10 years out. So that means there would be a permanent loss in economic activity. And the trade sector obviously will be taking the biggest negative hit. So, specifically under this scenario, real exports would be out 6.5% lower than our baseline forecast, while real imports would be down 3.4%. And total fixed income is lowered by 3.2%. As such, tariffs would not be a shock to the economy like the severe one we experienced with COVID. Instead, it would be a structural change in how the economy operates, and as such, Canada and other countries subject to tariffs are made worse off.
All right. Thanks, Arlene, especially for noting the difference between our forecasts and our scenarios. So, what types of Canadian goods are likely to be targeted, Arlene? I mean, should I stock up on maple syrup and Crown Royal whiskey?
Absolutely. Very good question, Kristen.
Oh,
It would be probably good to stock up on any Canadian good while you can. Based on what President Trump announced, we should expect all Canadian goods will be targeted and subject to a tariff. We will wait to see what is announced in the coming weeks, as the next deadline for imposed Canada specific tariffs is March 4th. Now, right now, we only know about the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum that are planned for March 12th. And as the U.S. imports most of these metals from Canada, it is not unreasonable for U.S. prices of autos, appliances, pop cans, and other goods that are use these metals as inputs to jump as the tariff would be passed on to consumers. Now, while it hasn't been announced yet, Canada would respond in kind, which would push up prices here at home as well. But just to give you an idea, generally, if we use the household consumption price deflator as a proxy for inflation, and we assume that these 25% tariffs were placed under our scenario work, we show that price increases in Canada would be higher going forward, but the biggest price inflation increase relative to the baseline would be in 2026 by about zero point 0.7 percentage points, or double the rate estimated for 2026. Now, to put some numbers in as an example, household spending prices were anticipated to increase 0.8% in 2026. With tariffs, they would increase by 1.5%. So, just when we are expecting price pressures to ease for housing related costs, specifically like shelter and rents, tariffs would erase these easing inflationary pressures, putting more strain on household budgets.
wow. Doubling. That
Mhm.
is, I'm glad you put some numbers in there to really illustrate that, Arlene. Now, what do you expect from Canada in terms of a response to US tariffs?
Well, the government has been clear from the very beginning that whatever the U.S. imposes on Canada exports, Canada would match the tariff rates and the dollar value of imports. Earlier this month, before President Trump announced the pause on tariffs, Canada provided an initial and very detailed list of U.S. exports to Canada, totaling about $30 billion, that would be subject to counter tariffs, including food, tobacco products, clothing and footwear, items such as toiletries, wood and paper products, gardening items, household items, and appliances. Now, these were chosen initially with the intent to limit the harm to Canada's economy and Canadians. Now, this may seem like a lot, but another large grouping of items will follow with a much larger dollar value that would cause a bigger hit to the economy on both sides of the border, such as including items related to autos and energy. But one example we can show is from alcohol. Now, one might not think that this is a big deal for alcohol given the size of Canada relative to the US. And we know, like, for example, that big box stores, they may purchase greater volumes of alcohol, in particular beer. However, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario is the largest dollar value purchaser of alcohol in the world. Therefore, the board makes significant purchases of higher price alcohol. So, such industries like the U.S. alcohol distilling industry could be hurt by tariffs.
Wow, I did not know that. The largest dollar value purchaser of alcohol in the world is the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. So, other than alcohol, what U.S. industries or products might experience supply chain disruption, higher costs, or other impacts from Canadian tariffs?
Well, Kristen, the Canadian government has stated that everything is on the table. And we have to look at our overall trade outlook and the value in what is being traded with the US. Now, the current share of the Canadian exports to the US is about 76%. They get all of our exports. The top Canadian export item to the US is our energy exports. That's because many border states and other regions are heavily reliant on Canadian energy through well established pipelines. And we export about 4 million barrels of oil per day. We also export gasoline, natural gas, and electricity where infrastructure does not exist within the US to service border states. Now, a tariff on gasoline would drive up the price of fuel at the pump, for example, and some people estimate that it would be up to 75 cents additional to the price of gasoline per gallon. Now, this increase in gas prices would run counterbalance to Trump's campaign election promise. And this is probably why Trump revised his broad based 25% tariff on everything from Canada to imposing a smaller tariff on energy at 10%. Yet, when you look at our overall trade balances with the US and Canada, our energy trade is what's contributing to Canada's trade surplus with the US. If we were to remove energy, the US has a trade surplus with Canada, and that's something that's existed since 2008. US producers and refineries in distribution channels cannot just flip a switch to pump more US oil. Therefore, US states importing Canadian energy will feel the impact immediately of tariffs. But as always, Canada will continue to be a reliable, low price, and safe resource of energy to the US.
Wow. 75-cent addition per gallon at the pump. As my husband will tell you, Arlene, I notice when it goes up 3 cents, much less 75 cents.
Exactly, it will be noticeable.
Yes. Now, tariffs aren't the only uncertainty facing the Canadian economy, as you know so well, Arlene. Canada's experiencing a period of political uncertainty right now. And I know you're not a political analyst, but could you give us the broad strokes of what the political situation is in Canada for our listeners who may not be up to speed on that?
As you know, Canada has its own domestic issues when it comes to politics. Federally, since last summer, there's been a growing discourse within the federal Liberal Party, with elected members leaving or making announcement that they would not seek re-election during our mandated fall election. During the holidays, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that he would be stepping down as Prime Minister and Party leader. He's asked the Governor General to prorogue government so the Liberals can have time for a convention and pick a new leader, which is underway right now, and hence you would also have a new prime minister. Now, there are currently four possible candidates in the running, but the top two include former Bank of Canada and Bank of England Governor Mark Carney and former Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Now, before Justin Trudeau announced that he was stepping down, polling results showed that Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party, would have a hefty lead over the Liberals by at least 23 points. A more recent poll showed that if Mark Carney would become Liberal leader, that favorable gap would close significantly to about just 8 points. Therefore, Canadians are growing more discontented with Prime Minister Trudeau and his policies. So, in about a month's time, when Parliament is back in session, either the Conservatives or the NDP would call a non confidence vote, which would then trigger an election, probably in the late spring. But in the meantime, negotiations and talk with the US continue to hammer out a deal regarding tariffs, and every political party will be firming up their policies by the time the election comes around.
All right. Thanks for that overview. That's really helpful context. And what does that political uncertainty mean for the economy? I'm specifically thinking about business investment, but I'm guessing it's not limited to just that.
You are very correct. It isn't limited to investment, but is one of the top concerns, as that it will be vital to keeping the economy chugging along for a while now. So, what we've seen in the past for many quarters, the Bank of Canada Business Outlook surveys, they've shown that firms on balance are reluctant to spend on investment or expand payrolls. Now, a big driver of those responses was the unknowns regarding the outcome of the US election. and the timing and the depth of the monetary policy easing cycle. Now, in the latest business survey, results show that spending is advancing within the energy industry, but not much elsewhere. So, this high degree of uncertainty will always slow or pause business investment. Some of the hot topics right now that people will be focused and business will be focused on in the election include removing the carbon tax. No political party favors this tax anymore, at least for consumers, but we don't know if there's going to be changes or revisions or what it would be replaced with. There's also talk about reversing the capital gains tax increase that was announced in the 2024 budget that was to go into effect of June of 2024, but has now been delayed till January 2026. But based on what's going to be happening, that will probably be a non issue after a federal election. They will also need to look at effective housing policies to help address the shortage of affordable housing units as parties and candidates announce their plans. Some of them are just coming out right now, so we'll get a better idea later on. But overall, government financial supports or changes to fiscal policies are important to provide some sense of stability that the private sector can't yet provide. Now, we expect the economic outlook will have a high degree of uncertainty until we know the election outcome and the policies that will hopefully keep Canada's economy afloat. Yet I want to note that there are some upside risks to the investment outlook, and that is related to the removal of interprovincial trade barriers. Now, this is something that all political parties support, and there has been plenty of talk about it for decades, but now there is a political will for some type of resolution. Now, there is an extensive list of trade barriers, but all levels of government can act on restructurings to boost productivity and investment, making Canada stronger as a country. So, for example, if provinces recognize labor accreditations, labor would be able to move quickly across Canada, easily filling in labor shortages, especially for skilled labor, and that's a concern that's still ongoing right now. We also see that if there's a removal of regulations, could open markets across the country instead of relying on foreign markets. So now let's look back at our liquor control board example. Now each province has its own liquor control board with its own set of regulations. And as tariffs are introduced, many provinces were pulling U.S. liquor off their shelves. So instead of sitting empty, reducing interprovincial trade barriers would allow, for example, Ontario to make more purchases of BC wine, potentially replacing wines from California. Now, another example is eliminating cross Canada transportation restrictions. Here, the size of transport trucks in Canada, or specifically in Quebec, is different from those in Ontario, limiting the transportation of goods between the provinces. So, removing these transportation restrictions allow for a greater flow of Canadian goods to non-US markets. Now, there is increased talk of having an east-west pipeline from the prairies through to Quebec. So instead of, energy traveling south through the US before coming back to Quebec, there can be a direct link through Canada. So there are opportunities for investment spending to advance, but agreement is vital to make this happen. Plus, we also just heard that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced plans to build a high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City. And the investment in the faster movement of goods and people would increase productivity. Obviously, some of the investment will take time, but some of these restrictions could be resolved in a timelier fashion, which in turn would provide some upside to the investment outlook.
That is really interesting. I didn't realize that so many interprovincial barriers existed in terms of trade throughout Canada. Very interesting indeed. And I'm also curious about what BC wines taste like. So,
Mhm. It's all
but
good.
it's all good. All
All
right.
Canadian wine is all good.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a future podcast
That's
episode.
right. That's
We'll have the wine tasting episode. So, with all of this in mind, Arlene, what monetary policy actions are you expecting from the Bank of Canada?
well, overall, the Bank of Canada is likely done with large interest rate cuts. We did see the Bank of Canada doing two consecutive 50 basis points reduction in the overnight rate, but we don't expect that to happen now. As inflation's been near about 2%, the will be focused on the excess capacity in the economy and the labor market. The Bank of Canada was the first to lower interest rates among the G7 countries last year, and it's already cut the overnight rate by 2 full percentage points. It's a lot that's already been done, and that's still working its way throughout the economy. Now, in the January announcement, the Bank of Canada highlighted the resilience of the Canadian economy especially when it comes to household spending and the improving labor market, given that the unemployment rate is down from the recent November 2024 peak. But additional easing is anticipated. We are expecting the central bank to pause at the March meeting. However, it is understandable that the forecast could change if there's a significant change in policies from governments from either side of the border. And given the probable trade policy impacts resulting in lower demand and the economy probably operating with excess capacity, more interest rate cuts are likely, with the overnight rate probably hitting about 2.25% this year.
All right. And what indicators are you watching that might tip the balance, Arlene? Like, for example, our purchasing managers index, maybe?
Absolutely. That's one of the top leading indicators that I'll be looking at. Specifically, I'll be seeing if Canada's manufacturing indicator remains in expansion mode or will it dive quickly into contraction, signaling a recession. I will also be looking at how Canada's comparing on a global scale because recently Canada's performance has been bucking global trends. But that's not to say I'm ignoring lagging indicators either. So just this morning, Statistics Canada reported the number of business openings and closings, and we've seen that the number of active businesses is trending lower. And when I was looking at the details, manufacturing businesses were not faring well at all. In fact, the number of active manufacturing businesses are at a new low if you exclude the years since COVID, and it's not much to go off, but the data go back only to January of 2015. But also, I'll be looking to see if Canada's service sector will pull up the slack like it did during the COVID downturn, suggesting that Canadians are willing to spend given their available capacity to spend, but not on goods imported from the US or at US retailers in Canada. This will all depend on how Canadian consumer sentiment sours with the US and how far consumers are willing to support a made in Canada movement. Importantly, I will also be looking at Canada's labor market. I would expect, based on survey responses, that job creation would stall and the unemployment rate would crank higher, but that hasn't been the case at least yet. I know anecdotally, I've read articles where firms that have a high exposure to the US market through traded inputs to the manufacturing process or whose sales are concentrated in the US are laying off staff just because of the threat of what may happen with tariffs. So, rejigging of supply chains can take time, and that can also shift job creation priorities.
Lots to watch there for sure.
Mhm.
Mm. Now, Arlene, I could keep talking to you about this, but it's time to wrap up our conversation. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Absolutely. I think one thing that everyone should be concerned about is that we have a very high, elevated degree of uncertainty. We haven't been in a situation like this before. So, navigating and forecasting an outcome is so much harder, which is completely understandable. Trade policies can shift swiftly, but the Canadian government will adjust to minimize the impact on the economy. Plus, upward inflationary impacts will be very apparent. Given the announced tariff rates, it can go higher than anticipated because there's a lot of back and forth trade for many goods, not just autos, which is famous for crossing borders about 8 times from start to finish between the two countries. But even when you go do something else, like so for next time you go out for a surf and turf dinner and you just think when you get the check at the end of the night, when you look at the market price, which is much higher than you may have expected, it's because the production of cattle and the processing of lobster could have crossed Canada US borders several times, piling on 25% tariffs each time, and the costs are being passed on to you, the consumer. So, what you should expect is the unexpected when it comes to tariffs and inflationary pressures.
All right, you heard it here. Expect the unexpected and watch those lobster prices.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Arlene, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. That wraps up this episode of the Decisive Podcast. Until next time.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.